Thank you. What a wonderful audience to get to talk to. It's been really fun to get to talk to some of you yesterday and today, and many of you are people who I've long admired, and so it's really great to be here and be invited to speak with you. And also, huge congratulations on hiring Jessa Lingle. You guys are going to love her. She's fabulous. She's been a postdoc with us this year and last, so she's terrific. So what I want to do today is to give you pretty much an overview of the book that I am writing now. I'm really interested in feedback because this is very much in process. I've written several articles out of this material, but I'm now doing the big pull it together into a book process. And oh, it turns out to be a tangled web. Who knew? Who knew writing a book wasn't easy after all? So this is an overview. I could, single slides are whole chapters, so I'll try and keep on pace here. So I want to start with a story of a band called Marillion. This is Mark Kelly, who plays keyboards with them. They're from England. And at some point in the early 1990s, around 93, I think, he's not quite sure, somebody gave him a pile of paper printed out that came from a fan mailing list where fans of his band were talking about them. And he read this stack of paper and he said, wow, this is really interesting. I should find these people. So he got on his modem and he dialed into the internet, which 93, most of us were not doing that. I was, but for context, in 1993, when I was going to communication conferences and giving papers about the internet, I was spending literally half the talk explaining the concept that people were using computers to talk to each other. Right? So right now to say, oh, this musician went and found his fan group, like, well, duh. But at the time, it was actually pretty wild that he even knew what the internet was. So he goes to this fan group. He subscribes and he doesn't out himself, and he's lurking. He's just reading what everybody is writing for a couple of years, silently reading. And there was an immediate surprise, which was that he didn't know they had a North American fan base because they didn't have a North American distributor for their music. And yet almost everybody on the mailing list was from North America, which again, if you know about the internet of that time, is not surprising because of the development of which populations used it. At some point, somebody in this list says something that's totally wrong, and he can't help himself. He has to out himself and tell them that they're totally wrong. And as soon as they realize that a guy from the band is actually reading the list, their immediate question is, why don't you tour North America? And he says, well, every time we've ever toured, we had money from the record label. It would cost about $60,000 or 60,000 pounds for us to tour North America. The label won't put it up, so that's why. And instead of the fans saying, okay, they said, well, what if we raise the money? And he said, sure, go ahead. We're not going to have anything to do with it, but if you guys want to raise the money, go for it, right? And then he pretty much forgot about it because it seemed like such a bizarre idea. And then they raised $65,000, and he had to tell the rest of the band that they were touring North America. So this is often looked at among crowdfunding scholars, not just fan funding scholars, but crowdfunding scholars as the birth of crowdfunding as we know it now. And if you think about platforms like Kickstarter or Indiegogo or GoFundMe, they often trace their origins back to this moment, which was instigated by the fans, and I think that's a really important point, right? This was not a top-down idea. This was a bottom-up idea of, wait, we can support you. This idea that the fans could be a direct source of revenue, that there were ways to think about getting money from audiences beyond having them buy your album, has gone through some really weird and problematic transitions in the time since to get us to the point where it now looks like this. How do you monetize your fans? And my favorite is this thing right up there, monetizing Facebook fans, the cash cow waiting to be milked. Moo. Moo, 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 moo. What does it mean to monetize your fans? What do you have to do in order to be able to monetize fans? Well, here's some ground rules. This is from a study that MTV did a couple of years ago about how millennials engage music. So people up to, I think, age 34. And these are two of the key findings that they highlight. So one is this zero distancing. These are direct quotes from their report. Artists are expected to be constantly accessible, especially on social media, offering unique and intimate moments to fans. And the artist as friend. Today, there's an expectation for direct interaction between fans and musicians. Millennials crave intimate glimpses into the mundane daily activities of their favorite celebrities. If you look at Twitter, Twitter is driven largely by people wanting to follow celebrities and get glimpses into the intimate details of their everyday life. So I'm interested in the problematic that this raises, which is what you're talking about here are interpersonal communication skills with large anonymous audiences, which is a completely different set of skills from what you're talking about when you're talking about making a great album, putting on a great concert, or even giving a good interview. And it's that tension that sort of drives this project. Jacques Attali wrote a really important book about music called Noise. And he has argued, this comes from a title of a talk that he gave at Harvard last year called Music as a Predictive Social Science. And what he meant by that is something that actually comes up in music scholarship a lot, and which that story that I started with is indicative of, which is that what happens in music often happens later elsewhere in the world. So when we look at music, it's almost always at the leading edge of a cultural shift that will follow in other domains. So this shift to fan funding, it's not coincidence it originates with music, because so many cultural transitions originate with music. You can go back and people argue, for example, that the rise of individualism in the 12th century and onwards begins when soloists start stepping out from the chorus and getting individual attention as musical performers. And we can go on and on and on. But the point is that music is not just about music, it's about the cultures in which music happens. And what happens there tends to happen in other areas afterwards. I should also just say, feel free to interrupt me with questions or comments or whatnot as I go along. When I started this project, I was not focusing on this. This is a good example of how ethnographic and qualitative work tends to morph as you go along. But what became clear to me in thinking about, well, what does this speak to outside of music, was that it speaks to a lot of issues around contemporary labor and labor shifts that are happening. So even though I had passionately tried to avoid the word labor in my work, it became completely unavoidable. And I had to go read all that stuff that I sort of dreaded. And it turned out to some of it be pretty interesting. Go figure. So there have been a lot of shifts around contemporary labor that really play out very, very clearly in what I'm about to talk about. And again, where you can argue that it happened in music there before it started happening in a lot of these other sectors. So one, of course, is this shift toward less and less material production, so that all of us in this room are manufacturing ideas rather than objects. Certainly music is immaterial. The collapse of the music industry, in as much as there has been a collapse, can be traced largely to the separation of the music from the material objects on which the industry was built. It was an industry built on selling the objects that had the files that had the music or the grooves that had the music, and now that people don't need to buy that object, what will they spend money on? There's also been a shift in labor toward being more and more affective, in the sense that many of us are in the professional role of managing other people's feelings and ensuring that everybody has a good experience. Or not, affective labor is not necessarily making people feel good. If you talk about people like the ones who come to repossess your car after you haven't paid your money, there, the affect is supposed to be tough and mean, and you're supposed to be making people feel very intimidated. But in either case, it's the same idea that much of work becomes about creating a kind of emotional, experiential environment for people rather than just delivering them an object. Lisa Adkins, who's a labor sociologist, talks about the cultural feminization of work since the 1970s, and the idea that more and more work revolves around these ideas that are associated with female-gendered work, like hospitality, service, caring for others, and so on. Certainly, work has become ever more precarious. We don't have this sense of I'm working for a company for the rest of my life. People switch jobs very frequently. Nobody goes to work for IBM thinking that they're going to retire from IBM in 55 years. Everybody assumes they're going to switch jobs. Everybody in our current jobs think about, how does this set me up for the next job if this one doesn't work out? Tenure is one of the very few cases where you don't have to think those thoughts, because in most environments, you could very well be looking for a new job soon. That's one of the fun things about giving up tenure and going to a research wing of a company. And then, of course, enormous amounts of technological change, as we all know, that have disrupted labor in all kinds of ways. So all of these four things completely happen around music and speak to much broader issues. Is there anything else I want to say about that? Oh, the other thing I want to say about that is this is not new to the 1970s and later. There's a fantastic book by James Kraft about the Musicians' Labor Union, the American Federation of Musicians, from 1890 to 1950, where he shows how technological innovation, in particular sound recordings and radio broadcast, completely devastated the music industries and professional musicianship. Particularly, well, there are a lot of points along the way where it happens, but the addition of sound to film put 20,000 musicians out of work overnight because every small town theater no longer had its own little orchestra. It decimated professional musicianship. So a lot of these things have gone back quite a ways. Kraft's take on it when he looks at, well, what does this tell us about technology and work, is it usually isn't good for the workers, what happens. And I want to raise some questions about whether what's happening in what I'm talking about is good for workers, but also whether it's good for ourselves as social beings in this world, to have our sociality appropriated for labor in these kinds of ways. At the same time, music is a form of work, but it's also profoundly and deeply and always social. So does anybody know what this is over here? History quiz. 40,000 years old. The bone flute, the first evidence of musical instruments, 40,000 years. 40,000, that's like before capitalism, that's before money, right? So people were making music way before anybody had thoughts about monetizing or selling or charging or anything like that. Music, in its origins, in the overwhelming historical time of its existence, has had nothing to do with money. And today, it still, in many ways, has nothing to do with money. Money is this weird culture that's been grafted onto it in all kinds of disruptive ways, but it's not music's natural state. So musicologists talk about music as a basic form of human communication, which allows us to experience being human in ways that language does not. One musician I talked to described music and conversation as opposites, because in conversation you speak with your logical mind, and in music you can, what did he say? He said, and then there are all the confusing things that you can't say, so you have to put them into a song. Right? So music allows us to articulate things that we can't articulate linguistically. So it's part of what it means to be human. There is no culture on earth that has no music. There are cultures that have viewed music as threatening, but there are no cultures where there is no music, in the same way that there are no cultures where there is no language. And it's kind of fascinating here in a communication department, I'll just say. ICA last year, there were, I think, 2 papers that had music in the title. We completely ignore music as a form of communication. As much as we talk about conversation, it's a phenomenally neglected field in communication studies. And yet, when you go to talk to the musicologists and read what they're writing about, they're often writing about human communication and relationship. So here's the crux of my talk, and after this I'll turn to telling you the methods and elaborate on it a bit. Sorting through all of this material, I've come to think about what's happening in terms of relational labor. And the core idea here is this idea, you saw those monetize, 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 the idea that in order to be a marketable musician, You have to get online, you have to have a social media accounts probably, and you have to directly engage your audience and give them intimate glimpses into your mundane everyday life, no matter how awkward and uncomfortable that may feel for you, and no matter how little your audience may actually want to know the truth. And it's always tied to work. So you have this weird bridging of these interpersonal goals, these interpersonal skills, these interpersonal communication processes with these financial goals and these economic goals and these desires to be able to sustain a living making music, which of course requires that you get money. And I'm certainly not saying relational labor is unique to music. In fact, my point is exactly the opposite, that relational labor is more and more common. Now, there has always been relational labor. If you were a real estate agent, you had to form a relationship with your client. If you were a financial advisor, you formed relationships with the people whom you were advising. What is different now, because of social media, is the idea that you have to do it continuously, like every day, or at least a few times a week. You know, you can't show up once and then go away for 4 months and then come back, because the relationship will not have been sustained. So it's a continuous process. It lasts a long time, and your audience is very unclear. There are specific individuals you may know, but there's also this follower count, and who knows what's going on in there? Who knows who all these people are? If you are a marginally successful musician, you might have 2,000 or 3,000 followers on Twitter, which is no Kim Kardashian numbers, but it's still enough that most of us don't talk to 3,000 people at once, let alone about intimate details of our everyday mundane lives. So it's really challenging. So when I think about relational labor, I think about, well, what are the practices and the skills that it takes to do this? And what are the outcomes? And as a theorist, I think about what is the basic nature of this problem? And the answer to that I come up with is that relational labor is inherently dialectic. Dialectic theory goes back a long time. You can go back to yin-yang and the ancient Chinese. I was talking with somebody yesterday about the lack of Chinese influence on communication scholarship, but actually dialectic theory goes all the way back to that. So there you go. This is a book that I really love by Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery about interpersonal relationships. And this quote, I think, really encapsulates what I'm trying to get at, which is that social life exists in and through people's communicative practices, which of course should be something we all agree on, by which people give voice to multiple, perhaps infinite opposing tendencies. Social life is an unfinished, ongoing dialogue in which a polyphony of dialectical voices struggle against one another to be heard, and in that struggle, they set the stage for future struggles. So rather than seeing relational labor as a thing you do, a practice, a skill you acquire, I see it as a constant process of managing opposing, competing tendencies in order to make this message right now. Right? In the same sense that our interpersonal relationships always require continuous generation of messages, and those messages always pull us in opposing directions. And when we have a really nice relationship where everything's working well, we're very unaware of that. And when we get a little tension in the relationship, suddenly we feel like, oh, you're cramping my style, right? And autonomy versus connectedness becomes a really big issue, right? How do I tell you this in a way that preserves my autonomy yet affirms our connection, right? A classic dialectic that we all struggle with. Okay. Now let me back up and tell you about the research a bit. I wanted to know, the question that drove this was really, how do musicians understand their relationships with their audiences and their communication with their audiences? I had been going to music industry conferences. I was seeing a lot of people advising musicians to connect, engage, and monetize. I was seeing a lot of things like on the social media pyramid, which recommended, what balance of links to pictures, to personal disclosures, to self-promotion you should have. People were trying to give advice, people were trying to be helpful, but then I was listening to the questions musicians were posing at these events, and it was often things like, do I have to be on every single social media platform? Do I need to use Flickr? What am I supposed to tweet? I don't know how to tweet. I'm supposed to blog. Is blogging still a thing? Do I really have to, what am I supposed to blog about? Lots and lots of confusion, lots and lots of anxiety. there certainly are some people who said, oh, this is great, I've always wanted direct engagement, and now I can have it. But for a lot of people, it seemed much more like a new set of demands being placed upon them that they didn't know how to do. So I really wanted to know from their point of view what's going on here. And is social media totally changing everything, or has it always been that way? And we just see it now, because often social media exposes social dynamics that have been in play for a very long time, and people make the mistake of thinking they're new because they only just see them now, but in fact, they're reflecting long-standing processes. So I interviewed musicians. I'll put up a list of them in a second. I was interested in how social media have affected this. I had them all transcribed. It's about 800 pages of interview transcripts. Lots and lots of iterative analysis. I'll just put up here, these are the people with whom I spoke. I don't expect you to read all of this. I just put it up because usually somebody will be like, oh my God, you talked to, and I never know which person it's going to be, so it's always fun. But the point that I will make is that I did try to get some national diversity. Obviously, it leans heavily toward English-speaking US and UK. Most of these people had audiences before MySpace happened, so that they could reflect on having had an audience and having had interactions with audiences before that expectation came in, that of course they would be engaging their audiences. Yes?
Why these countries?
Why these countries? Because I was recruiting through my social networks, and this is where they took me. Okay. It wasn't like I want one person from Spain, I want 2 Norwegians. It was that these are where connections led me. And this is obviously a highly non-representative sample of global musicians. And yes, Joe?
I was just going to ask about that, not representativeness so much as the threshold beyond which a person goes ahead and hires people to help. I mean, I'm sure, like in other parts of the world, there's industries of people who do this for people.
Yeah.
Just as they used to with letters.
Right.
So what is the threshold at which a musician can say, I'm going to hire people to help me do this?
Well, I think there's kind of two kinds of thresholds, and one is the financial threshold of can I afford somebody? And the other is a much more personal threshold of do I feel okay having somebody else speak for me? And actually the people that I spoke with, some of them felt very strongly that they needed to post everything they did. Some of them who are more successful, like Nathan Harold, who plays bass in the band Fun, who have been super popular the last few years, just stay away from Facebook and have their office take care of all of the Facebook stuff because there's just way too many people and it doesn't scale well. So I think it's an issue of scale, that when you have 10,000 people asking you questions, you can't do it yourself. But it's also an issue of personal proclivity. So there'll be a lot of cases where the band has an official page and that's run by interns, or an official Twitter account, the band Twitter account, or the band Facebook page, and that's run by hired people, but then they'll still have their personal accounts and they'll still have fans that follow their personal accounts. So I don't think there is a clean threshold. And people who you would expect sometimes to, of course, have hired help have chosen not to on that particular matter. And I've actually been surprised in presenting this. The general assumption is that no musician is actually using social media themselves, that it's all hired staff, and that's really not the case. That it's an enormous amount of even really popular, successful celebrities who are just whipping their phone out of their pocket and tweeting a little something or taking a little picture. So there is actually a lot of direct production of social media messages by musicians. Even Beyonce, right, who has, 75 quadrillion Twitter followers, even though she's never tweeted, but she's all over Instagram. But she has a social media manager who makes sure all of this stuff happens, but every single thing goes through Beyonce. So even at that level, she's still personally saying, yes, that picture's okay, yes, no, not that one. So it's not as clean a they do it or they don't line as one might think. Okay, that's great. Now everybody got the chance to see that I interviewed somebody from a band called Necromantheon. Love that name, Necromantheon. He was so sweet. Okay, so with that set up, what I want to do is give you 3 examples of people who I think have different perspectives toward relational labor with the idea of giving you a sense of the spectrum of ways that people think about this. And then I want to give you 6 dialectics that are at play here. So I will start with Lloyd Cole. Lloyd Cole is a singer-songwriter. He gained a lot of success in the mid-1980s. I think his first album came out in 1984. It was super successful. He was sort of an indie darling, toured all over the world, did really well, and he's still making a living at it, though it has gotten harder and harder for him. Now, he is somebody for whom music is about creating beautiful objects that you put on a pedestal and they make your life more pretty. And he's very worried that if people get to know him, if his personality is in the way, that's going to interfere with the beauty of the objects he's created. So it's not about, I have this huge ego and I shouldn't have to talk to the little people, the fans. It's about, I might get in the way of their experience of my music, and that's the worst thing that I could do. So he's very, very ambivalent about it. And yet at the same time, he's now completely independent. He sells his music out of his house. He and his wife sit there and they address the envelopes and they send it out. And he knows that he has to engage the fans personally or they don't buy. It's just an empirical fact. So after shows, he goes out there to the merchandise table and he stands around and he signs the CDs and they tell him how much the music meant to him. And he's like, oh, that's nice, good to know. Yeah, And then some drunk fan corners him and he's terribly awkward and terribly uncomfortable and he really wishes he could just get out of there, but he smiles and nods his head saying, okay, this is how I make a living, right? So here you have a pretty good example of alienated labor, right? Here's somebody who is forced to perform a kind of sociality that he is not personally comfortable with, but which he knows he has to do in order to be able to make enough money to continue being a professional musician. Ironically, he's thinking about retraining as a journalist, because heaven knows there's a field that hasn't been hurt by the internet. Good luck, Lloyd. I love Lloyd. Okay. Steve Lawson is at another extreme. And Lloyd is by no means the extreme of finding this stuff alienating. There's some people who just opt out altogether. They can't, just really don't want to deal with it. Steve is probably, short of Amanda Palmer, probably about as far to the this is not alienating, this is who I am in my core kind of experience of relational labor. You can see he's got 10,000 Twitter followers, but he has over 130,000 tweets at the time I took this picture. I tweet constantly, and I still am way below 50,000. So, and I tweet a lot. So, as some of you know, Steve likes to play house concerts. He talks about his music as the soundtrack to friendships. I'm making friends with people who listen to my music, and then I become part of their life, and they become part of mine, and I'm truly enriched by that, and the music becomes the soundtrack to the relationship. So for him, the whole point of making music is to experience relationships with the people who like that music, and to anything that helps him get closer to his audience and get rid of all that baggage of rock star and into the language of friendship. He's all for it. That's what he wants. That's why he's a musician. And he's played with very, very successful bands. He played bass for Howard Jones in the 80s and toured all over in huge stadiums. So he's lived that life, and he's chosen this one because it is more fulfilling for him, because it's what David Hesmondhalgh would call good work, in the sense of not being alienating and contributing to flourishing. In between, you have somebody like Zoe Keating, who is a really interesting musician. She's a cellist, a solo cellist, and she does looping, so she builds these really amazing soundscapes by playing with herself. It's music that is incredibly hard to categorize. iTunes doesn't know where to put her. Is she classical? Is she alternative rock? They don't know what to do with her. She has well over 1 million Twitter followers. And the reason she has so many Twitter followers, even though she plays a genre of music that very few people actually listen to, is that somebody at Twitter was a fan. And when you sign up for a Twitter account, you can press a button to pre-populate your account with a bunch of people Twitter thinks you should follow. And she ended up on that list. And she still doesn't know who put her there or how, but there she is. So she's given this gift, or not gift, of millions of people paying attention to her tweets who are not necessarily listening to her music. Now for Zoe will say, for better or worse, my inside voice and my outside voice are the same voice. So she doesn't feel alienated by communicating and interacting with fans. And in fact, she feels like it's really essential to her income, again, as an independent person. So here's a really, really long quote. What she's saying in this quote, she's using the metaphor of stealing from department stores, although then she says, I don't think downloading is stealing, so I don't mean to take that analogy like that. But if you have the idea, hey, this is like some small family grocery store, and if I take this, it might actually hurt them. Once you start thinking that way, that changes your behavior. So I know that I need to let people know that I live entirely on album sales, and I just need to be vocal about that. And then once they know that, then they might actually buy a record, because I know that these people might be listening already. I get these emails a lot. People have been listeners for a while, and then it wasn't until they got to know me on Twitter that they bought my album. So there's something there. So with Zoe, you have somebody who is very comfortable engaging her audience at a personal level. She talks a lot about her child. She really horribly, her husband just passed away from cancer in his 30s. And we watched all of that on social media. She was open. And her fans also gave her a ton of money so that she could stop making music and care for him and their son. So she's very happy to foreground her identity as a wife. She's very happy to foreground her identity as a mother. These are not challenges for her. And yet at the same time, she's very clear on the economics of this and sees it as very clearly tied to making money. So I would see her as somebody sort of in the middle who's very comfortable with relational labor and at the same time does see it as a form of labor. Whereas somebody like Steve Lawson doesn't actually see it as labor at all, and somebody like Lloyd Cole sees it only as labor. Again, this is a spectrum. It's meant to be evocative, not definitive. But hopefully it gives you a sense of sort of the different ways that the different stances people have, and the idea that relational labor is not inherently alienating or not alienating. It's something you can take different positions toward. So these are some dialectics that frame it. These are the chapters of the book I'm writing, so each one is going to be really abbreviated. So first you have this huge tension between economic value and social value. Forgive Trent's language, he's like that. What is the value of music? Right? And certainly I've been arguing that music has extraordinary social value, and that's why it exists, and existed long before we would ever even think about money. And yet, if you listen to the dominant discourse of the music industries now, when people will say, with no self-reflection, music has lost its value. People don't value music anymore. Right? People are listening to music all the time. People are making music all the time. People are engaging music all the time. Music has tons and tons of value. But does it have economic value anymore? Will people pay for it anymore? That's one kind of value, but there's a lot of other kinds of value at play. So we have these tensions between the economic and the social value. And musicians are often very well aware of this. So Brian Travers from UB40, who is, UB40 have sold something like 70 million records. They've been wildly, wildly successful and have stayed in business long after their big hit, Red Red Wine, which you may remember if you're of a certain age or listen to retro stations. He's talking about performing and making music, and it's catching the audience and it's touching them. So emotional, affective kind of engagement there, right? It's touching them, and that's not easy. Anybody who thinks that easy, he's crazy, but you can't substitute it with industrialism, with manufacturing bits of plastic. So you have that tension between, is it about $10 or is it something that you can't think about in industrial terms because it's this much more intangible, ephemeral, affective connection that you're after. Uh-oh, you gonna stop working on me? Okay, so here's an example of the kinds of things that musicians talked about when they were articulating values other than economic value. And this is David Lowery from Camper Van Beethoven, who is, and Cracker, and he's very outspoken about music policy, copyright policy. He really is a firm believer in intellectual property. He's very opposed to a lot of technology companies, which he sees as profiting by putting ads next to unauthorized downloads. and really being horrible to musicians' well-being. Although it was funny, when I went to Microsoft, he said he was glad I was going to work for the ethical company, which those of us who lived through the 80s kind of have to chuckle at that. Oh yeah, Microsoft, the ethical company. So this is a story that I heard a lot, okay? I remember this one guy, he used to always argue about politics on my Facebook page, and then I noticed he sent me a message directly, and it's about how his mom is dying, and her final request is a Camper Van Beethoven song, Take Me Down to the Infirmary. I don't know, he wrote me this really interesting note. It was just how his mom was old, but he played Cracker so much, she started listening to Cracker, and it was just interesting. We always have these kind of nice little personal conversations now. I was kind of stunned and flattered that somebody would, basically the song that she wanted to hear on her deathbed, and it was just, wow, it never really occurred to me that our music could penetrate that far into someone's emotional life. This story of somebody sent me a private message and told me that my music was helping them cope with death, I couldn't believe how much I heard that story. I heard it from probably 8 or 10 of the musicians I spoke to when I said, give me an example of an interaction with your audience that you found really rewarding. Outpoured these death stories. And what I like about this quote is that he didn't even realize his music was that valuable, right? It was the direct engagement with his audience that taught him that his music was that valuable. So how do you monetize this? Is this $10 or no? That doesn't, you know, that logic of the value of music is $10 doesn't even make sense up against this kind of way of thinking about value. So these things are in tension, and yet at the same time they might be productively brought into conversation in ways that enable them to work together rather than at cross purposes. Okay, a second tension is around the music industries, which is this tension between predictability and uncertainty. And you have this ongoing problem that there's enormous uncertainty in the music industry. Now, this has always been the case. It's always been based, I mean, always since the 1920s, it's always been based on a model of, we don't know which things are going to be hits, so we'll just invest in a whole lot of them, and then 1 or 2 will be hits, and that'll pay for the rest of them. So which things were going to be successful has never been predictable. But now you have this other kind of predictability too, which is that the technologies are constantly changing. So it's not just that, oh, wow, film has sound now. What does this mean for us? It's, oh, are we all supposed to be using Meerkat and Periscope? Are we supposed to, you know, or whatever thing came out today that I haven't even heard of yet? Meerkat and Periscope are live streaming Twitter apps that came out, you know, 2 weeks ago, and suddenly everybody's all about Meerkat. I'm sure there have been blog posts written about how to promote your band using Meerkat, because those how to promote your band using blogs come out constantly. It's amazing. So you have this huge confusion. You can see the progress from MySpace to Facebook to Twitter. Everyone loses their mind at the latest thing and says, no, this is how you do it, and there's never any sort of consensus. I mean, as corrupt and horrible as the old record industry was, at least it was a barely stable way to get the word out about music. So this sort of reminiscence for, oh, we used to be oppressed and exploited so predictably. Wasn't that great? So you have this constant uncertainty and this constant need to figure out what you're supposed to be doing, and nobody actually knows. I think nobody actually knows if having an engaging social media presence actually even connects to how much you sell. You can hold up examples and say, well, here it did, but in general, across the population, I think we really don't know. As Erin McKeown talks about, and she says, these social networks come along, and all of a sudden, here's this new number that can be used. It's not necessarily how do you monetize your 1,400 Twitter followers, but how does that translate into people in the room? I know people who have really lively online fan bases, many Facebook responses, lots of Twitter followers who draw the same amount of people that I draw. There's this conversion that doesn't necessarily happen. I've begun to think of it as 2 different careers. So at the same time, everybody is pushed into engaging in all of this relational labor, having a lively online fan base, offering them intimate glimpses of their mundane daily lives. It's not clear that it actually works in the economic way it's supposed to. Dissertation topic. A third tension is around the platform. So I'm talking here MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, these social media platforms, which on the one hand offer these incredible possibilities. And I don't want to downplay the power of being able to engage your audience directly, because that can in fact be a really powerful, empowering, exciting thing for many, many people. So when MySpace happened, this is Stuart Braithwaite from the brand Mogwai, who are quite successful, and had an audience prior to MySpace. They started in the 90s. He says, when MySpace became popular and people could write straight to a band, I think that a lot of people had never considered that you could just email a band. And when that first started, we got a lot of correspondence from people I don't think would have considered sending us an email. So what platforms have opened up this incredible outpouring of direct contact that wasn't there before. And in some ways, this is fantastic, and in other ways, it's problematic. They also open up possibilities of delivering direct-to-fan sales. There's all kinds of things that social media platforms make possible for musicians and others that weren't available to us before. I was asked, my book, Personal Connections in the Digital Age, is coming out in a second edition next month, and when I submitted it, the marketing forum asked me to provide 12 tweets that they could tweet, 12 quotes from it that they could tweet in promoting it. Hey, that's great, you know? Let's have all my tweets go viral and everybody will buy my book. I'm all for it. Great possibilities. But at the same time, we do bump up against limitations, and often these are built into the infrastructure, right? Facebook has all kinds of limitations. The fan page offers a lot of really great things. You can't have a fan page unless you have a personal page. So if you would like to use Facebook as a musician, but you don't want to use it as a guy, too bad. You have to use it as a guy in order to start a fan page. So that's one example of a limitation. Facebook has also decided that nobody can have more than 5,000 friends because they read some paper by Dunbar and they go, oh, okay, 5,000, that's a good enough number, fine. Well, so Jill is somebody who would like to have friend relationships with her audience. She doesn't want to be the superstar that they congregate around, but she's got 5,000 friends because when fans would send her a friend request, she'd accept it because of course they can be her friend, right? But now she's at 5,000, so Facebook won't let her add anymore, which means she has to do this very uncomfortable work of saying to everybody, I'm sorry, I can't be your friend. Facebook put a limit.
Like Coca-Cola.
A page can have as many people, but a personal profile can't, right? So if you have a fan page, you can have as many as you want. But the fan page is structured very differently, right? It's non-mutual. They follow you, but you don't follow them.
Triage people to the
and that's what she does. She'll say, okay, I can't add you, but join my musician page, right? But that's not what she wants. That's not the kind of relationship she wants with her audience. She wants one where they're her friends. And Facebook structurally makes that impossible when you get to 5,000 fans. Fewer if you have other friends, like family and things, who you'd like to add. So this is just a structural quality of the site and something that's been built in by the engineers based on some model of human experience and the difference between being a musician and being a normal person that doesn't play out right. Another thing that happened with Facebook is they introduced fan pages long after they had introduced personal pages, and so musicians who got on early were friending their fans to their personal page, and then they invented this fan page, and people had to think about, well, do I move my fans over there now? And how socially awkward is that to say, you know, hey, I know we've been Facebook friends for a few years, but we're not really friends, so could you please go over to my fan page instead? Right, so again, relational labor, this is work, this is not fun, this is not, no musician says, this is going to be great, I'm going to sit around in front of the TV every 2 weeks and I'm going to organize where my fans go because some engineer at Facebook has decided I can't have this many friends. So we're always getting pulled and pushed. The possibilities always come with limits that you bump up against and that take work. Another tension is around circulation and productivity. Production and consumption. These are both examples of audience things. This is a Franz Ferdinand fan art. And this is a blog where a guy in Chicago posts music from Sweden. Both of these examples demonstrate the way that audiences are making tons and tons of stuff, and musicians are becoming audiences for the stuff that their fans make. So the circulation is going around and around. It's by no means a one-way communication system. And for some people, this is fabulous. So here we have Kristin Hirsch, who has actually been supported by fans who subscribe to her music online since 1998, so almost 20 years now. She has funded her whole career on audience direct payment. She releases one unreleased song a month she's totally into this. For her, music is about spiritual communion. So when she sees the things that audiences create, their own projects like remixes of my songs, time-lapse paintings to my music, films, covers, all of that sharing they do, all of that effort and all of that involvement, it's one thing to be made somebody's soundtrack for a while. That is truly the highest honor I could ever hope to achieve. And then they go one step closer to making the music together by actually making it together. Right? So for her, the fact that the audiences can now create so much stuff and for each other, and that she can see it is just, that's how music is supposed to be for her. This is this participatory ideal of music. She talks about music as being God's devils and monsters to her. It's everything. But on the other hand, sometimes the stuff fans make is really icky, and it's not fun at all. So this is Greta Saltpeter, who ran across some fan fiction about her. Fan fiction really creeps me out. I have Google Analytics, and sometimes fan fiction will come up, and there's one that's so disturbing that I read last week where it was a lesbian love scene between me and a girl who's in a band called the drummer, Tennessee, who's one of my acquaintances, and I really like her. And it was just this really, really disturbing sex scene between us. And then at the end, you know, all these kids can comment on it, and someone says, "Oh, that was very smart and very classy." And then another girl goes, "Oh, what a great pair. I never thought of Greta and Tennessee." And that kind of thing just really, really weirds me out. This is the point where I'm so grateful that fan fiction has not hit the Academy yet. I haven't seen Tennessee yet since I read it, but I'm probably going to feel weird when I see her, even though she wasn't involved in it at all. So lots of times when we think about fan productivity and the things fans are doing, we think about it in terms of, oh, they're uploading things to the Pirate Bay, they're torrenting, they're distributing bootlegs, things like that. But it's a much richer terrain than that. There are so many things going on that raise so many wonderful opportunities and so many problematics. This all boils down in a lot of ways to issues around identity. Is this me, the personal me, or is this me, the professional me? And where does that boundary lie? So this is Mark Kelly from Marillion again, with whom I started. I got told off by my wife for posting stuff that's too personal. The thing I got told off about was tweeting that I had a vasectomy. But you know, it's like if you're going to do it, well, for me anyway, I felt like I had to sort of do stuff that was going on. It might or might not be interesting for other people. I haven't done it so much lately. Maybe I went too far. Right? So he crossed over into too personal, at least from his wife's point of view, right? And this is an interesting point, is that at this whole provide intimate glimpses of your daily life involves other people who have opinions about what you're disclosing, right? And actually, family were very frequently putting limits on what the musicians were allowed to talk about through social media. So he really wanted to be personal. He was very happy with that. This is D.A. Wallach from the band Chester French. The interesting backstory on Chester French is that it's two guys, and they happened to be students at Harvard in 2005 when Facebook started. So they were the first band on Facebook. And this guy talks like you would expect a really smart Harvard graduate to talk about. He's got all the language of business down. He's amazing. He's now Spotify's artist in residence. And so he's talking about, well, how do you relate to your fans? He says you want to create an exciting experience of being a fan for your audience, and that involves both presenting and concealing information in interesting and surprising ways to make it fun to follow you, fun to wonder what you're up to. I think as an entertainer, there's kind of value to answering 1 out of every 10 questions, so it feels really special if you do. And if you're kind of reinforcing some sense of inaccessibility or stardom. Right? Now, he's a great example because he's got it all down, right? He's got this logic totally figured out. Here's how I can deliver the exciting experience I want my audience to have. How many of you have heard of Chester French? Okay, 4 of you. So how well is it working? I don't know. You know, for somebody who seems to have the logic down that well, it's not like you're all like, yeah, of course, Chester French. You know, I'm bored you do. That's awesome. It has not actually led to mass stardom. Okay. And then finally, what kind of a relationship is this? And the tension between feeling like this is about performers and their fans, or is this about friendship. And for many of them, like you saw Steve Lawson saying, the soundtrack to our friendship, the friendship is the goal they want. This is Roger O'Donnell, who plays keyboards for The Cure, not exactly a small band. How many have heard of The Cure? Yeah, a little more popular than Chester French, right? So he says, I don't like to call them fans, not anymore. They're more like friends, people that are interested in my music and what I'm doing. I get 3 or 4 emails a day, and I answer, and I have good conversations with people. There are other musicians I spoke with who are far less popular, who have rules like, I'll answer every email. Everybody who emails me, I'll answer, but only once, and if they write back, I won't reply. In order to keep that distance. Or I'll continue to correspond with them until a red flag comes up. And if they say something like, I've been having so much trouble with my dad, he's bipolar, that's when I stop writing back. Right? So everybody's got to kind of manage this, but Roger, he's all, this is great, I have all these friends, I love it. Sievert, on the other hand, who is a huge star in Norway, he's really nice. He doesn't want to be rude, so he gives out his phone number and things like that. Sievert. Okay. If people want to get a hold of me, they can. So some people, you just start communicating, they just it can take up a little bit too much of your time because they write back all the time. And I don't want to be rude, but it can get a little too friendly. Right? So here's somebody who, it's not that he doesn't want to be friends, it's that the demands that all these people are putting on him are just completely overwhelming, and he doesn't know how to draw those boundaries clearly in a way that he can live with. Billy Bragg, I think, had a great perspective on this, which is he thinks of what he's doing as bringing together a bunch of people and letting them talk to each other. And a lot of people talk about it this way. They say, it's real autonomous. He's talking about his fan board on his website. It's real autonomous, and sometimes they get pissed off with me, but they like getting together at Billy Bragg gigs. That's what they do. They might not like Billy Bragg. I mean, I spoke to one of them the other day, and she's absolutely clear that she's not listened to an album I made in the last 10 years. That's cool. I'm not worried about that. That doesn't bother me, the fact that I provide them with a social framework. I really like this articulation of providing them with a social framework because it really emphasizes the way out of this, which is to say, this is about you guys being friends with each other, right? And I'm here to provide that framework so you can be friends with each other. And then you don't have to necessarily be friends with them yourselves all the time. Okay. So, to return to the idea of music as a predictive social science, and to end, what can you take from this about where the future of work might be going? One point, of course, is that this need to build and maintain social relationships. And, like in the academy right now, we have this whole process going on around, should we change the ways that we assess people for tenure and promotion to somehow account for social media presence? Right? Is that some kind of work that deserves validation? And people have different opinions about this, but this is very much a conversation that is alive in the academy. And certainly in writing book proposals now, it's really nice if you can talk about how many followers you have and whatnot. And of course, these are technologies, these are platforms that really push people toward more interpersonal, more personal forms of engagement, and not broadcast, I have a new book coming out, I'm going to be here doing this, I'm going to be there doing that. That's seen as doing it wrong. So there's this ongoing pressure to build and maintain social relationships as part of work, which again is not new, but is happening on a different scale and with somewhat different dynamics now that it's happening through social media. Social relationships, as in the case of Monetize Your Fans, are increasingly viewed and structured through economic lenses. How is this going to relate to being marketable, to being paid? If you think about LinkedIn, LinkedIn is all about being able to demonstrate your marketability by having enough connections in your network. And if you go down into, well, what are those connections? Sure, there are people you work with, but they're also your friends, right? So what does it mean if we're in an environment where there's a cultural pressure to understand our friendships and our social encounters and social relationships in terms of what can this do for me professionally? How can I enroll them in my social media profile so that I can demonstrate that I would be a good hire, that you should publish my book, that I'm the kind of person you want to give a contract to, and so on. And the people who are making the profit are not necessarily those doing the relationship. So if we think about Facebook, if we think about Twitter, the musicians and the fans are the ones who are doing all the talking. it's not the musicians and the fans who are making the money that Twitter and Facebook get. The advertising revenue is not going back to us, right? It's going to them. So all of our sociality through these platforms is really being appropriated so that other people can make money on it. Mark Zuckerberg is now, I think, the 15th wealthiest person in the world, right? And that's because we socialize with each other. Clearly, communication skills are not going anywhere, more important than ever. The point I take from Billy Bragg is that what's going to be really important in sustaining this kind of work is going to be enabling our audiences to communicate with one another so that we don't have to be there constantly tending the flock. If we want to have any kind of ability to distance, we need to build communities that are somewhat self-sustaining. And then the last point that I'll make, it's not exactly a future of work, but I think it's a future issue that we really need to think about, is we need some kind of ethics for how to be a responsible, humane audience, which is something that I don't think we've ever really talked about. What does it mean to be a kind audience, a caring audience, a supportive audience? We talk about it in terms of, oh, well, you ought to buy the music. If you like the music, buy the music. I totally agree with that, but I think it's more than that. It's also, if you like the music, don't write articles about the singer having lesbian sex with somebody else who's a real person, right? And on the one hand, maybe that doesn't need to be said, but on the other hand, actually real person fan fiction is a thing that's out there, and there's a lot of it, right? And I know that some bands have actually had fist fights over it. So I think we need to think about, what does it mean to be a responsible audience? Is it okay for somebody to write to sievert over and over and over and over and demand his responses? What does it mean when we can have direct engagement? All the focus is on how do you do the engaging, but what about those people being engaged, and what is a responsible way for us to behave as audiences? So I will leave it at that, and I'm sorry that I ran a little long. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So you talk about communication between musicians and fans. How about between musician and musician? Did that come in you?
That comes up a lot. Yeah, and actually I think a lot of them feel like one of the best things about social media has been that it's enabled them to connect with other musicians. And that's partly as fans, because musicians almost always are fans. That's why they're musicians, because they were huge fans. It's really fun when you see a musician tweet, "Oh my God, so-and-so at-replied me." "Oh my God, you at-replied me." It's like the great chain of at-reply bliss. They also talk about it as being incredibly useful for collaboration, as getting new opportunities to collaborate. Some of them are doing collaborative work where it's entirely over email. They found each other on social media, and then they've never actually met, and yet they've recorded a song together. They talk about it also as having made it a lot easier to tour, because you can find musicians elsewhere. But they also, many of the people I spoke with attributed the death of MySpace to that same thing, which is that a lot of the story of what killed I mean, it still exists, but really? A lot of people think about what killed MySpace as being Facebook, or as being all of the spam that showed up on pages and porn spam on everybody's pages. But a lot of the musicians I talked to felt that what killed MySpace was all the musicians always saying, "Hey, can we tour together? Hey, I'll get you a gig in my town if you get me a gig in your town." So that actually became a problem for many of them and drove them off. Joe?
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question about music as a predictive social science.
Yeah.
And the question I have is, I think that what you say, particularly at the end, are propositions that you talk about many media industries.
Yes.
So the movie industry, the book industry, whatever, marketing certainly. But in terms of the actual world of people, nurses, postmen, to me that's not, it isn't predictive of their world. On the taxi drivers, maybe if you use Uber. But I guess what I'm trying to understand, and it's not just about this, but it's a lot of the work about labor when it comes to media. I can't feel sorry for, I feel sorry for the guy whose wife died, things like that, but as a particular case study, of people who are really struggling to survive in a transitional world. That's happening all over the place.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's happening not only in media. It's
Right.
happening in the nursing business. It's happening, so I and the propositions there don't seem to map onto
Those
nurses
stories.
do, what people, clerks in front of hotels do. The everyday people who don't relate in the same way, they go on Facebook, but in a different dimension,
Right. And absolutely, absolutely. And the people who are, I mean, I don't want to, there are a lot of things in your comment, and they're all really good points. One is, of course, there's a ton of kinds of workers who will never have to cultivate audiences. And I'm certainly not making the claim that everybody will have to cultivate an audience. I do think that we will see more and more kinds of careers expecting that you've cultivated an audience. So I would not actually be surprised in 20 years if when hiring a nurse, you do look at some kind of social media metrics to assess whether this nurse is popular with her patients. Right? I would not in the least bit be surprised to see that happening.
I agree with that.
Doctors, absolutely. So I think that it will infiltrate other fields, and that's what I mean by the predictive part. I certainly don't mean it's going to infiltrate every single field. You're absolutely right. In terms of pity, that's kind of a hard one, because on the one hand, I think about this as a scholar, right? And I have corporate sponsorship so that I can be a scholar. Right? It's not really all that different from if Target had said, we'll fund your music career, here's a nice salary, go write songs and release them in the world, and we'll get the ephemeral glow of your success. Very few of us would expect to be able to make a living just by writing our academic books and articles, right? We sort of understand that that's not actually a skill that anybody wants enough, right? So we have to teach, and we help run the university, and we do all these other things in addition to our scholarship to sort of justify the time that we spend on scholarship, even though it's a thing that we're evaluated on, right? It's still not a thing that we would imagine we could just go out into the world and do, and if I have a right to get paid, I wrote an article, right? So in that sense, no, I don't think that we need to feel sorry for musicians. On the other hand, I do think that musicians are at a particular juncture where the digital technologies have upset the models of how money flows in ways that have made it really, really hard to do what they do. And they're really having a very, very hard time figuring out how to do it all and what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. And I think those questions that they're wrestling with about how do you build a sustainable career in a time when so much of the things that we produce can be transmitted digitally without credit, without payment, without any of those things. And the fact that the nurses and the doormen at the hotels and the taxi drivers are more poor and are in more precarious situations also means that they're less likely to go to a concert and spend money because they don't have it, right? So it's all interconnected. It's all part of the same economy that's just making it really hard for ordinary people to build a sustainable living unless they get into some kind of infrastructure that just pays them to do what they do. So, and we know that we're moving toward more and more freelance work, not just in media, but in general. So to get freelance work, you absolutely have to have sort of an audience of people who will tell you you're good at it, will refer you to other things. So if you think about like Gina Neff's book, Relational Labor, about people in Silicon Alley in New York City, they were doing enormous amounts of work, enormous amounts of going to parties until 2 in the morning where women are dancing in cages so that they could shake hands and meet people and get the social ties that would allow them to get hired. So
I guess the bottom line question in this regard that I'm asking is, how does that affect the content? I mean, to what extent does everything you're talking about affect the nature of music?
Of music itself.
And what does music mean? I'm not even sure exactly what music means, but
yeah, you and everybody else.
How does it affect?
How does it affect what the music sounds like?
Yeah, exactly. What are the implications of the story that you've told for what everybody else gets or doesn't get when it comes to music?
Great question. And again, I think there are a lot of layers in the response to it. I think that here we get into the struggles between art and commerce, right, that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. Certainly, if you are a major record label, you are less and less likely to be willing to take a chance on somebody who has not already demonstrated that they have an audience. So the music that gets produced is more and more likely to be the music that has already found an audience, and that's going to be the people who had the skills to work these media so that they could. Now, does that mean that it's slower or faster or major or minor keys? That's really hard to say, right? That's really hard to say. Musicians tend to feel like most artists, right? They can't. I make what I make, right? And my creativity is intrinsic to me, and it should be unaffected by outside forces. And if I allow my content to become affected by what the audience wants, then I've sold out, and I'm no longer a respectable musician. I'm inauthentic. That's obviously problematic. I don't know how to answer the question about how does it affect the sound exactly, other than to say that the sound is something that people tend to feel very protective of as the creators of that sound. And yet, if you look at, who are the biggest stars when you turn on the radio, lots of times the performer whose name is on it had very little to do with the creative process that led to its production. So something like 97% of pop hits in the world were all written by this guy Max Martin in Stockholm, who's got this studio where they just all come through and he churns them out, and out come these global pop hits one after the other. And nobody's really, some people have heard of Max Martin, but when you listen to Britney Spears or Beyonce or whoever it is this week, you don't go, oh, there's a Max Martin hit, unless you know, right? So a lot of times the content wasn't even coming from those people in the first place. And then other times it is. So it's really hard to know. The musicians I talk with, even the ones who want the most participatory models of engagement with their audiences, don't want the audience writing the music. That they'll draw the line there. Maybe they'll get the audience feedback of, here's my 17 songs, which 12 should go on the record? Or what sequencing do you think makes the most sense? But in terms of, you need to have more bass in there and things like that, people tend to be pretty, unless it's Max Martin telling them, they tend to not want to hear it. You had your hand up and then go there.
Yeah, thanks very much for this. I'm curious what the folks you talk to, when they think about making a living, and what their historical reference points are in that area when it comes to being a musician and making a living. I think sort of going back to Napster and Lars Ulrich of Metallica, and now through Spotify and all this, there's this narrative that we hear often from really successful musicians that you can't make a living today in the new media landscape. But historically, being a musician
make a living
wasn't
anyway.
Exactly that, thing to make a living. So I'm curious what the folks you talk to, do they look back at sort of some golden age where all these musicians were making money, or do they think that how do they historicize this, and how does their conception of the future fit in with that history?
I would say by and large, the people I talk to historicize this all the way back to the 1970s, and they don't go back further than that. I've been at music industry events where I have pointed out that music existed long before money. Blows people's minds that maybe music was not always about selling a consumer product. So I would say that the historical lens is really, really short. A lot of people I spoke with have struggled to make a living as musicians, and struggled in the 80s and struggled in the 90s, and some of them did it for a few years, and now they've supplemented it with other kinds of work to be able to continue doing it. And some of them are fine with that because they really like owning a home and putting their kids through college, and others really can't bear it because they want to be doing it. I think there is this cultural mythology of somehow it used to be really easy to make a living as a musician, which I always just find really shocking that narrative survives, because I knew a lot of musicians in the 80s, and one of them became famous, and the other hundreds they're doing other stuff now. It's really hard to make a living. So, but that said, the artists I spoke to who did have label deals in the 80s are really struggling now and are really, really worried about how do you build a sustainable career. And even those who have ended up going independent, most of them do feel like it's very hard to do it without a label that's willing to invest in you up front. So I do think there is a sense of now, not all of them, some of them feel like this is great. There's so many ways to make a living. If you don't want to be a star and you don't want to be rich, you can make a living. It's no problem. Like Steve Lawson, I'll just do house concerts and sell my stuff on Bandcamp, pay what you want. It's fine. So I would not say that musicians are speaking with one voice on this, but I would say that in general, the historical lens doesn't go back very far. You had a question, then we'll come back.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'm curious if you've thought at all or theorized a bit about because what we're talking about here, like the relationship between musician and fan, but there's kind of this thing that's in between that relationship, which is the music, right? So the fan originally has a relationship with the music, and then that leads to a relationship with the musician. So there's this kind of, like the way the relationship gets initiated is kind of different, right? So some of the examples, are people talking about how the music impacted people, like the fan's mother on her deathbed or whatever. But then you have other people who just want to be acknowledged, like people who are just like, Taylor Swift, retweet me, please. Like, just acknowledge that they exist. So I'm just curious if you've thought at all about how music sort of mediates that relationship.
Oh, very definitely. And Lloyd Cole wanting his music to be a thing of beauty and being worried that if the audience knows him, it will interfere is an example of exactly that. Because it's really the problem is that when you are moved by music, it's a social experience because it's usually embedded in some sort of peer group, but it's also a profoundly internal experience because it's in your ears, it's in your body, it's energy in your body. It feels very personal and in a way that emotions do, right? It's an affective response. And if there's lyrics that you identify with, it's very, very hard. I mean, I had to grow up a lot before I could say, that's the song. It's not the person who wrote that song, right? It's very easy to conflate those. And so the musicians have to deal with the ramifications of that, right? That somebody thinks they're in love with them, right? And every single person I talked to basically had stalkers, right? Male or female, right? Because they think as fans, and I feel this way about Sievert, for example, Sievert Hayem, who I really felt like I had a very deep personal relationship with him, even though we'd never spoken, because he spent so many hours in my ears, right? I was living in his voice. It felt very intimate. It felt very personal. And I was really grateful that I was old enough to recognize that that was not actually about Sievert Hayem, the man. Because Lord knows in my teens, in my 20s, that would have been ambiguous. And so that mediation of music is really complicated because the musicians know that they're not the music. But I would say that it also sometimes does go the other direction. So for example, somebody like Zoe Keating, who's got 1 million plus people following her on Twitter, does pick up new fans because they become interested in her, the person, and then they want to hear the music. So it can actually go the other direction.
Yes, so thank you very much. I just wanted to go back to one of the ideas that you mentioned, that the irony of the situation is that all these musicians are supposed to build their audiences, but they don't really know why, because no one has actually shown that it works. And so my question is, how would you start answering that question? How would you measure a successful use of your audiences? Would it be in terms of records sold or whatever they sell today, or because then that's equivalent to monetizing your music, right? So ultimately, so how would you measure success in terms that are different from what corporations try to do and so on?
Well, okay, first of all, I don't want to say that people paying money for your stuff shouldn't be a metric for success, because I mean, I think that you can be successful in reaching people and changing their lives without making any money doing it, but then unless you have some other source of income, you're not going to be able to keep doing it. So if you want to have a sustainable career, I mean, I think about success in terms of sustainability, that it's not just going to be one and done, but you actually can still be doing this in 30 years if that's what you want to still be doing in 30 years. That's not how the music industry is set up. The recording industry is set up to, let's just get one hit record, recoup our losses on all those other ones, and then their first album that doesn't seem like it's got potential, we'll dump them and find some other person we can promote. I've thought about this a lot in sort of social scientific. How would you set up an experiment to study this, for example? And Joe's point about the content of the music is where it gets really, really hard, right? Because you can't control for what the music sounds like. So you could do an experiment where you could say, I work with economists, so sometimes I have these conversations. You could sort of say, okay, well, we'll take these different bands and we'll have this one engage their audiences through Twitter in these ways, and we'll have these ones not do that, and we'll look at what happens with them. But first of all, you might be doing harm, right? In the sense that if they then do not succeed because they participated in your experiment in the silent condition, you've ruined their career. But you can't ever control for maybe their band wasn't as good, right? Maybe somebody else's music was better. So, what I consider metrics for success are, I guess what I would consider the metrics for success are you, an individual musician, satisfied with where you've gotten to? And I think that standard's going to differ for a lot of people. But I think of it largely in terms of being able to have a sustainable career that allows you to make music full time if that's what you would like to be doing. Emily?
So at the beginning of the talk, you brought up the idea of music being older than money, and then you just mentioned it again a minute ago. And one of the things that you were also kind of setting up in the introduction was about how different this is for social media versus not social media. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about that, because presumably 4,000 years ago, people who are playing the flute, maybe there are other things they get, like first crack at the bison, or something, right, if they have friends or connections that the music is giving them. And so I guess I was just wondering to hear a little bit more about how much you think is specific to the social media context and money as a currency versus the other kinds of stuff that you get for having social capital.
Money as a currency is by no means unique to social media. That starts in the 1600s. Late 1600s is the first time somebody sells a concert ticket, for example. You had patronage before that. So money has mediated music for a very long time, nowhere near as long as music has been around, but money has been a mediating factor there for a very long time, and that's in no way new to social media.
Actively cultivating an audience so that you get stuff of some kind.
Yeah, well, so the whole idea of an audience is a 17th century invention, right? So that even with Mozart's awesome symphonies, he'd be playing those in the background while everybody was running around talking to each other, right? It was never, let's all sit and watch Mozart, he's going to play now, we'll be quiet, right? That emerged in the late 1600s in Vienna, and until then, there was not this concept of the music audience. So prior to then, the flute guy was playing the flute that minute, but then the next minute somebody else was playing the flute, and then somebody else was playing the flute. So when ethnomusicologists talk about sort of this long history of music and how it came to be commodified, they talk about the time before in terms that I would consider probably a little too romantic, but they talk about the times before in terms of music being Tom Torino has a dichotomy he draws. He's got a book called Music as Social Participation. He talks about participatory music and presentational music, and the shift from participatory music, where everybody in attendance had a role to play, whether it was that they were clapping or that they were going amen, or whether they were singing, or the idea that everybody in the music event was contributing to making that music happen, to a presentational mode where you, if not suddenly, because it takes a few centuries to develop, but you get a split between the people who play the music and the people who listen to the music. So for the guy with the bone flute, probably, 40,000 years, who knows what was on their minds, but probably the idea that he was special because he played the flute and those people didn't would never, ever have occurred. That of course he played the flute, everybody played the flute, that was what you did, that's how you talk to God when you're walking in the forest.
One more question.
Thanks. That was, to quote you, that was very rich terrain. Very interesting to us. And I just wanted to make an observation before I ask a question, and that is, I think maybe it's important to rethink that conversation-music dichotomy, because conversation has rhythm, it has tone, it has phrasing, we feel it in our bodies. It sometimes isn't very good music, but I think linguists
No,
are really
yeah.
interested in the musical dimensions of conversation and language.
Mhm.
But in this whole business of sort of what is the recalibration of social distance that goes on with the introduction of new forms of communication, and particularly in the context of the market. So the musicians that you're talking to, they want to shorten the distance between themselves and their fans, but in doing that, they face certain perils, which is the peril of the stalker and things like that. And then you also talked about the musicians whose wife was unhappy about the vasectomy being shared and all this kind of stuff. So when new boundaries are being worked out, is you're trying to get closer to the audience, but at the same time there's some kind of boundary that has to be drawn between you and the audience. Are there thematic things that show up again and again? Because you mentioned 2 examples about sex, which is, and I wondered what are the new rules emerging thematically about what is too much to say in terms of content? It's just the same old boundaries as always, or is there something emerging around social media that's worth paying attention to?
Yeah, I love that question, because the quote that I put up from Mark Kelly about telling about the vasectomy, what he said immediately afterwards was, interesting times, people are still trying to figure out the boundaries of what works and what doesn't, and nobody knows. So they're actually explicitly talking about it in terms of the boundaries are shifting and we don't know where they are anymore. And clearly sex is problematic as a thing to be sharing with a large audience. But if you take something like kids, is it okay to talk about your kids? Boy, you get huge differences there, right? Some of these musicians are posting pictures of their kids from pregnancy through, I've watched some of these kids grow up. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's getting so big, And others of them will not mention their kids. And if the fans mention their kids, they go in there and go, you don't talk about kids. That's off limits. So I don't know that there are clear boundaries about this is okay and that isn't okay. And I think that probably it depends a lot on the persona of yourself as a musician, right? So if you are, for example, a heavy metal musician who's doing death metal and singing about Satan and stuff like that, and you're posting about, oh, look at this beautiful dinner I had last night, that might be totally unacceptable, whereas for a different musician whose genre wasn't all about being evil, a pretty picture of your dinner might be a wonderful moment of insight into your life. So I think that it's really hard to know. We're all struggling with these boundaries, right? It's not just musicians. We're all struggling with what do I put on Facebook or Twitter. And just watching Twitter for the last 6 years, I think people's behaviors have really shifted on Twitter and how personal they're being and what they disclose on Twitter. So I think these boundaries are very much in flux and very much still being decided. Please?
Examples that you mentioned, kids, sex, dinner, and then you mentioned death earlier. And all of these are very body-based boundaries.
That's a great point.
Kids are
You would
really,
point that out.
and so I think
that's a really nice insight. That's a really nice insight.
So I do need, so we stay on schedule, to stop. No, I want to take my prerogative is that you need to make one comment based on Carolyn's, though. It strikes me that one of the boundaries that'd be interesting to think about is, and ironically, given this is all about getting closer to fans and also about the body, is we can't meet. In other words, that you can have relationships with your fans, but those relationships with many of the fans but I'm not going to be in the same room with you in certain circumstances for the large fan base that you have. And so it's a kind of a strange setup where you want to be close, but for many of them, I would suspect, you also don't ever want to physically be with them. And so that's kind of that may be unique to this kind of social media approach to dealing with people. Just a comment.
Yeah, nice point. Let me just say one other thing, which is that these people don't all want to be closer to their fans. Many of them do, but a lot of them really don't, and really kind of resent that this is the way culture's going, and they now have this horrible expectation when all they really want to do is play their guitar and write beautiful songs.
Okay, we'll have to edit that.
Thank you all for staying.